Please explain how authors are being exploited by book publishing companies.
Well, as a publisher and an author, I have a unique perspective in this industry. As an author, I can tell you that many authors, particularly scholars, give away too much of their rights to their intellectual property. On average, it may take you as a scholar 5, sometimes 10 years to publish a book, a monograph, single authored monograph. And so all that energy and intellectual effort that goes into publishing a book, authors will often give away that intellectual property and all that energy and effort for no more than 7, 8%, maybe 10% of royalty. That's net royalty after taxes and everything else. And so what they give away also, which is more crucial to me, is a copyright. You see, the difference between copyright, that is the ownership of the work that's being produced, and the capacity or ability for the publisher to publish that work. They're separate issues, but often what publishers will do, they'll fuse them as one. They'll essentially say that you're granting me, the publisher, rights in perpetuity, that is forever, usually 70 years after the author passes away, and it can be renewed by the publisher. So in perpetuity, you're granting away the ownership of your intellectual property in your work and the exclusive right for that publisher to be the sole publisher to distribute your work across the world. So what I do is I separate the two. That is, I separate ownership of the work, make sure that the copyright is in my name, and then allow the publisher exclusive right to publish that work for the time that I grant them to do so. At any point, I can pull the plug, as it were, because I own the intellectual property. So there's an important distinction that often authors don't really think about or unaware that the two, that is ownership in the work and the ability for the publisher to disseminate the work, are not the same. They're two separate matters. And that's where I think authors get taken advantage of or exploited, because often they give away their ownership in their rights, which I think is very similar to the music industry when you give away your publishing, which is your catalog, right? That is the intellectual ownership of your work, because ultimately that's what's going to essentially feed you over the long haul when ownership in that work will pay dividends for you over the long haul. So to me, the key issue that authors often get exploited by is a misunderstanding or unappreciation for the distinction between ownership of intellectual property that they have created and the ability for the publisher to distribute that work. They're two separate matters that are often fused, and that's where the problem lies.
Are book publishing companies getting into appearances also, or are they only getting a percentage of book sales? Are they getting percentages of any other use of the book by the author?
Well, that is in fact the key question. And so what publishers do, academic publishers, trade publishers, they in fact will essentially spread out the exploitation of the author's work. This is how it happens. And so there's percentages that they get obviously from publishing the work, that is sales from the work, but the sales in several ways. There's the physical copy, that is the hard copy and the paperback. But there's also the ebook, that is whatever is the EPUB file or it is another kind of file that goes on different platforms, whether it's on the Google Play or the Apple Store, or it is on a myriad of electronic publishing sites. And then what the publishers also do is they will serialize the work in terms of these library catalogs and library subscriptions. So they'll put the work inside the subscriptions, either which they own or through an aggregate, that is an independent company that works on their behalf. And they'll also exploit the work in terms of copyright that faculty may use. They may say, look, if you want to use this particular published work that we, the publisher, own, you have to pay a certain amount. And usually what libraries of universities will do, they'll pay a subscription fee, or they'll have essentially, individual scholars or professors or individuals who want to use that work pay a fee for using a portion of the work through a major aggregate like Copyright Clearinghouse, right, which is one of the largest in the country. And so publishers have a myriad of ways, which essentially they'll metastasize their ability, to spread out their ability to exploit your work in a number of ways. Book clubs, right? Book clubs, conferences, leasing, that is essentially limiting, let's say a school district or a group of teachers, or one teacher wants to use the work for learning materials, they will actually have to pay a fee for that reuse. So there's so many ways, at least 15 ways that a publisher will exploit your work, And most authors are unaware of the ways in which this works.
Seems as if the world misunderstands what Vodun is. Please explain what Vodun is and why it is so misunderstood across the world.
Sure. So Voodoo or Vodun is often represented in literature, in books, movies, and let's extent, in sort of the conversation that happens, if any, online and social media. Voodoo is one of the most misunderstood concepts because often it's tagged to voodoo, whether it's spelled with the double O, VOODOO, or it's spelled in some other kind of ways in which it makes it appear as that it's something that is demonic or grotesque, like voodoo, like woo, right? It sort of has that sort of Halloweenish, kind of feeling to it. So voodoo is often referred to as the spiritual forces or deities within the system of African spiritual practice that has its origins within the country of what is now Benin and Togo, among the Yoruba Fombe or Fon people. Now, from what I understand is that Voodoo is actually not the divinities or the spiritual forces themselves.
Hold on, before we continue, I want to clarify the pronunciation. So Voodoo and voodoo are two different things?
Yes.
All right.
Yeah, so Voodoo is actually the system of practices and rituals that are essentially the matrix or the body of knowledge and practice and rituals, right? Whereas the divinities or spiritual forces in Haitian Voodoo are referred to as Loa or Loas, whereas in Benin they're referred to as Hun or Hun. And so often what you'll find in literature, whether it's Wikipedia or other kinds of sources, they represent these spiritual forces as voodoo. But voodoo is not the spiritual force. It's simply sort of an umbrella term, right? For the sort of system of knowledge and practices and rituals that embody, right? Essentially the again, the entire edifice, that is the structure, for the system. Whereas the individual spiritual forces themselves are referred to as Hun, and then there are a myriad of them. And here's why. These spiritual forces or energies, they're no different than gravity or atoms or other things that you can't see with your eye, but we know exist because we have a sense that they do. And so wherever you find several bodies of water or mountains or hills or certain kinds of forests, secondary forests, primary forests, savannas, you name it, wherever you find these patches in nature, you'll find these forces that are embedded in those parcels, right? And so you have a myriad of names, much like in the Yoruba system, which people refer to as Ifa, but Ifa is one of the spiritual forces used for divination, right? And so Ifa is not the system. The system, from what I understand, is referred to as Isheshe. And even that may be incomplete because what I've discussed with others is that these African spiritual systems, as we call them, us meaning people outside of Africa and outside of the language, particularly the particular language is spoken, we have a way in which we have essentially, even when we try to leave Christianity or Islam or any other sort of Eurasian.
I'm saying we still fuse it.
Yes. So even when we depart from or have nothing to do with Christianity, Islam, we bring the cognitive world from Christianity with us. So by that I mean this: we bring the system, we bring for example, your houses, meaning we bring the temple, we bring the same vocabulary and logic and structures from Christianity and Islam into these systems. So when we think about the Yoruba system, the Yoruba doesn't have a system. The Akan don't have a system. The Akan don't have a spiritual system. What these people have, are essentially, cultural codes and so coded wisdom inherited from their ancestors. And so when I asked the question from my elders among the Akan people, my folks in Ghana, West Africa, what do you call this? They gave me a proverb. This is classic African folks, right? They said that, what we do, right? What I call spiritual culture, which is a sort of a bridge for something that we can't name. Spiritual culture, they said, is like a cloth. We created it, we wove it, we created it, we wore it, we washed it, and we passed it on to our children. And they do the same thing. Essentially, it's culture without a name. Because there's no need to name something that you live and breathe, right? And so by naming it, we do something that's what European white folks do, right? They have to have these schemas and categories because their thing about knowing is to control it. To know it is to control it, right? And so for many African folks that I'm aware of, particularly through the perspective or the pathway of their languages, they don't have a name for their culture. They don't have a name for themselves. So for example, the Yoruba are not Yoruba. That's what the Hausa people call them. So what we find is that people of African ancestry who have been dislodged outside of the African continent, for the last 5 years, they have developed a sense of looking at African spiritual culture, what I'm calling it, for lack of a better term, as traditions, as spiritual systems, and I think those words and what they imply are incomplete. So, for instance, African peoples don't name themselves, in the way that we think of. So, for example, the Yoruba are not Yoruba. The Hausa people that we call Hausa, call those other people Yoruba. Yoruba became Yoruba, right? The Igbo not Igbo. The Arab people refer to them as Oyu Igbo, right? Meaning that kind of people, right? The Akan are not Akan, because the Akan were called Tong or Tonoa by the Mande people. Tono or Tonoa means locusts, right? And you know what locusts are? They're pests for farmers because they eat their crops. And so you have intra-African terminologies that are being used to call those people. In other words, Africans have ways of distinguishing, I am this and you're that, or I'm not that because you're this. And the same is true for their spiritual system of tradition. They don't name it, they live it.
So based on all the African terms we have been given to Africans by non-Africans?
Yes, you have these interpolated terms, meaning those that are given from without, like African, Negro, Black, and so on. But then you have intra-African naming. The Hausa called those people Yoruba, which became Yoruba. And then, of course, when folks reach Cuba and Brazil, they refer to it as Lukumi or Nago, right? In fact, in Jamaica, which I just came from Jamaica, actually 2 days ago, you have a place called Nago Hills, right? And so you have these terms being created by Africans. These are intra-African, right, sort of naming, not the externalized, interpolated ones. The Akan are called Tong or Tonoa by the Mande people, right, who live in the Savannah region in West Africa, which means locusts, right, because obviously there's some behavior or character from these Akan peoples that made the Mande people refer to them as locusts, meaning as pesky, right, as troublesome to farmers, right? And so you have intra-African naming, which to me is a deeply understudied and fascinating arena for people to, if they really want to do African history, they have to do intra-African history, meaning what kinds of histories are being created among the encounter and exchange between African peoples on their own terms, literally and metaphorically, right? So that's something that is really undervalued, underappreciated. And so when you think about African spiritual culture, then what I've come to realize is that people don't have names for things that they live, right? So when we call it Yoruba system or the Akan system or Akan religion or Akan tradition, what are we really doing? We are framing what people do organically and without naming, culture without names, as I call it, or phrase it in the English language, that people naturally don't do, right? And so we give it a name and make it a thing rather than a lived experience because we are not in that experience, right? Because if we were, and in the language and in the cosmology, we'd just be living it.
So, all right. So what I'm hearing I'm using a European term, theological approach, right? Their experience is just to be instead of categorizing and try to structure. All right. Why does Vodun, I don't know what name to say now.
Well, Voodoo.
Voodoo.
Mm-hmm.
Why does Voodoo have such a bad name across the world?
Well, it's no different than Obia, right? Which we know of. It's a Pan-Caribbean term, much like Voodoo. And Obia is known throughout the Caribbean region, right? And even, it has migrated, for example, to England, where peoples from the Caribbean basin, particularly Jamaica, but not exclusively, have migrated to England and throughout, that particular, diaspora. And so terms like obia and voodoo, right, which gives it sort of, again, the flair of being something that is the demonic inverse of Christianity, meaning it is the polar opposite of something that's pure, civilized, and holy. Because of a simple fact, African cultural norms and forms have to be the boogeyman, right? Has to be the demonic inverse in order for Christianity to appear pure, holy, and sacred. In other words, it has to be flipped. In other words, think of it this way. Think of it as, you want to make someone feel awful. Then the way you do that is to make them essentially everything that they're not. It's to frame them as everything that they're not. And so, in order to make you feel good about what you do. And so it's the same kind of framing, right? They flip it. And they have to do that in order to get African peoples out of their righteous mind and out of their cultural norms and form, because they know, meaning these European people who became white, they know that their so-called notion of fake or false superiority rests on getting African peoples out of their righteous mind, out of their sense of themselves. Because their sense of self and sanctity and even sanity rests on their power base in terms of who they are. And so by calling it voodoo, it was called voodoo or obia because these were the weaponry against European empire, European slavery, and European predation and cannibalism, right? This was their power source. Planters throughout the Americas, slavers throughout the Americas were uneasy and did not sleep well because of so-called obia and voodoo, right? And so by making African people believe that their own spiritual culture, their own spiritual weaponry and technologies were in fact devilish or demonic, and this thing over here, Christianity, is pure, holy, and sacred, is to get people out of their power base. In other words, think of it this way, in a crude but hopefully helpful example. It's like, when children will dupe each other out of their money, they'll say, I'll give you, let's say a 10-year-old talking to a 3-year-old, and 10-year-old says, you have a nice, piece of paper there, which is a $100 bill. I'll give you all these shiny coins, which are dimes, right? But they're new. I'll give you all these shiny coins. Let's say it's about 100 dimes, right? For, that piece of paper, right? And the child would say, oh, really? All those shiny coins for this, partly, grayish, green, $100 bill, right? And so the child will take the shiny, quantity of coins for this $100 because the child is what duped into believing that this shiny thing, right, that appears shiny, right, is more alluring than that valuable but older and therefore more ancient, $100 bill that's wrinkly as a great grayish green, and that exchange is made. So that kind of duping, in poor metaphor, but I'm sure your viewers understand, is what happens. Getting people out of their righteous mind is how you get them out of their power base. How do you get them? Essentially, that's how you make someone a slave, right? Slavery, again, is a power dynamic. And in this power of tug of war, you have to make the people who you want power over believe that their cultural norms and forms are their worst enemies. Keyword believe, right? And you do that by making something shiny and alluring and seductive being the what? Frame of weapons for desire, right? But not simply desire, but desire through violence, right? You'll desire this through violence, right? And so it's through that, or those processes, that we end up, people of African ancestry, seeing obia as wickedness solely or only. Yes, it was wickedness for the overseer, wickedness and evil for the planter, right? Giving them a mirror image of who they are, right? Essentially, African spiritualities, in their more, unstained and unfettered form, on their own terms, is not about good and bad, but it's about destroying destruction, right? It is offensive and defensive. It doesn't seek to cause a fight, but if you bring the fight, it will bring the fight back to you. And that's what so-called obia and Vodun did. But of course, these are power bases that these, European white folks were terrified about. In fact, all throughout the Caribbean in the 18th, 19th century, there were at least a dozen or more laws on obia and so-called voodoo punishable by death. Now, you don't enact those laws for something that is superstition.
That's what I want to touch on, man. So if it's such superstition and such BS, why were they so terrified of it?
Because it was real. Planters were vomiting, choking on their own vomit. Planters were not waking up from sleep the next morning. Planters were having their skin just turn, to ash and just crumbling, right? And so they were terrorized, right, by a terror for which they could not stop. Because it wasn't a terror that was simply brought on by bearing arms. It was a terror that was brought on by, axe and machete wielding, insurgentists, right? And you had those in terms of revolts and rebellions. But it was a terror that was unseen but felt. That was known but you can't taste, touch, or see. That is the worst terror. An enemy you can't see is the most terrifying, restricting kind of force that one could have.
And you know what's wild? What I always is that Caribbean. I don't know about America, but America too. But most of the leaders that led rebellions were spiritual people.
Indeed.
And even if they were Christians, quote unquote, they seem to still have that African essence in them. So would you argue that they were all practicing African spirituality during their rebellion?
Of course, because again, they were in part or whole their righteous mind, which means they were operating from the nuclear weapon of their culture, or spiritual culture in this case. And so whether it is the Maroons in Jamaica or Suriname or French Guiana or Ghana, but it's not Ghana proper, or it's in Georgia or the Carolinas in terms of Denver Vesey. Let's put out the quotation because we don't know if that's his name or not, but that's what we have on the historical record. Or Nat Turner in Virginia, or here in upstate New York State, or all throughout, even in New Jersey, Perch Amboy, which is a major port, for introducing captive Africans into what it became New Jersey. So all across the United States, particularly on the eastern seaboard and in the deep south, you have people who are still within their cultural frame of mind and reference, who are operating from that nuclear power base of it, even in the framing of Christianity, meaning people can go to church and not be Christian. There's a conflation of that going to church or reading the Bible. In other words, I can read the Quran as a scholar. Doesn't mean I'm a Muslim, right? I can read the, whatever version of the Bible, because there's so many. I can read, Hebrew texts. I don't have to be a Jew to do that, right? So my point is that we often associate, the act of going to a place and reading a certain text or texts with being a member of the theology represented by those texts. And they're false, because they provide a cover, a veneer, for people to exist, to be, but again, without getting the sort of gratuitous violence showered upon them, right? And so, that was smart, right? That was wise, right? Because moving around, in rebellious attire is to bring undue attention to yourself. So yeah, go to the Masonry Church in the plantation, right? Yeah, cross yourself, right? But of course, what you don't know in heart and mind, and particularly deep down, buried in spirit, is what's bubbling, right? What's fomenting. And so to those rebellions and to those revolts, and even revolts in daily act, the poisonings, sabotaging machinery, that is the sugarcane machinery, or cutting down sugarcane early and not processing, because it spoils. Burning the sugarcane crop and not, of course, transferring it to the refinery, it spoils. Or the rice paddy, right? So sabotaging, undermining, I don't feel well today, I'm sick, whatever it is. There's a number of ways people revolted. And even when people worked diligently because they knew, again, the gratuitous violence was always, over their heads, on their shoulders, on top of their heads, they in fact would still do so in heart, mind, and spirit, right? Because they knew that, this is flesh. You can do what you want to this. Yes, it pains, but people, African people, had a sense about home, and home was never in a shack or a shed. Home was always, a spiritual place. In fact, it's one of my favorite proverbs from West Africa. says that spirit is our home and earth is our market where we come to do our transactions, right? And so they knew that this is, this temporal, material, mundane life is transactional, right? You and I meet, chop it up, we engage, we relate, but we know that that's our home, right? And so to me, that's liberating theology, if you want one, right? Because it frees you up from being bounded by, I don't want to die, right? That to me is an imprisoning theology, where death becomes, it's a trap, it's a prison, right? Physical death, and therefore harm to the body. And this is why I push back against, books or works like Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, where he basically argues that I don't want to lose my body. That to me is a Christian view. That to me is an imprisoning view. That is not an African-based view. Because it says, I don't want to lose this. I don't want to be in pain. I don't want to be in prison. I don't want, meaning the jail. I don't want to, I want you to harm or hurt this or maim this, right? I told my daughters, you better get me a good lawyer. Or if I go out, you better bury me properly because I'm going out for you. I'm not imprisoned by this, right? And that's an African spiritual culture view, which is liberating. The converse is imprisoning and entrapping. That's the power of dogma. But African spirituality, it frees you from that. Imagine if, folks in this United States and elsewhere throughout the world, all, 600 million of us plus, just one day took on that view. It's a wrap. It's a wrap.
All right. Can you tell us the origin story of the Dogon people, their knowledge about Sirius B, and why Europeans try to disclaim their understanding of Sirius B?
Great question. From what I know and remember about the Dogon people who live, on the Bandegara Cliffs, what is now Mali, West Africa, these are people who actually were not born there, because people are not born in the cliffs or plateaus, but they migrated there in an unknown time. And I'll probably refer your viewers to a number of books that lay out Dogon cosmology, because our time is limited in this. And it'll be great just to have a conversation, right, after having this common reference. And so there's a book called Conversations with Ogatameli, who was an elder, Dogon elder, at these two French anthropologists that had interviewed, I think 1950s, maybe a little earlier, but 1950s or so. And then there's another book, a larger book, the name will come back to me in a moment, it's in my mind, but it's not too clear right now, about the Dogon people that is really just it's called the Pale Fox, right? And the cosmology is laid out there. And so the Dogons on cosmology has a lot of similarities with the cosmology from ancient Kemet or ancient Egypt, right? Where, there is this sort of cosmic force, unnamed, ungendered, unknown, that is like the sort of dark matter, right? And out of that emerges, right, these forces, right? And that's really all the world is. Whether it's the universe or cosmos, it's energy and matter, right? Energy makes matter, and matter is filled with energy. Basically, matter is a densification of energy. Everything's energy and force, right? What's true in physics and chemistry is true for these African peoples way, way long ago in ancient times. And so out of this dark matter emerging these spiritual forces. And there's a spiritual force referred to as Ama that is crucial to these other forces that are extensions of Ama. And so you have the story of essentially one of those forces going awry, right? Think of it like cancer. All cancer is, and I don't want to be too crude, but all cancer is certain cells going rogue. And then, of course, fighting the body, right? Fighting itself. And so there's a force or forces, and hence the notion of the pale fox, that essentially goes rogue, right? And essentially wants to be, the creative force, right? That's sort of the architect. And this becomes the inspiration for Marimba Ani's classic book, Yurugu, right? The notion of Yurugu, the sort of rogue, right, that wants to essentially compete with and be like this creative force of the universe. You have it in ancient Kemet, right? And so that awesome and archaic, that awesome and archetypical battle between Osar and Set, right? That again, these two forces. One wants to take the place, of this grander, more pivotal creative force. And so you have this sort of cosmic battle that goes on. Now, there's much more to it, and that's why I refer your readers to these two books, The Pale Fox and Conversation with Ogatameli, because they'll lay out more details in which I can do with you in this time. The Dogon people, in that cosmology, therefore, they have a sensibility about the cosmos, right? Because what happens is when you live on these high mountains and plateaus, like the Bandegara cliffs, you have a certain perspective, literally and metaphorically. And so it is by the elders having spiritual eyesight, meaning they see not better or worse, but differently, right? Layered with empirical observation. In other words, being on that elevated plateau, you have let's say a telescope has it, because telescopes are usually placed on elevated platforms, right? And so you have that by the cliffs, naturally, right, organically. And then it is what? Long empirical observation on clear nights, right? Which are then ritualized, right? Meaning periodically ritualized, that one can be able to see. So you can see in two ways. Training your eyes, right? To be able to what? Sharply see what others can't see because of your elevated platform, and from what? Hundreds of years of doing this, right? And accumulated knowledge over time, right? So this is really empirical study, really. And then spiritually, right? Being able to what? In the dark nights, without any artificial light, that in the streets or otherwise, impairing, because light, artificial light impairs your vision, whereas clear nights, whether it's Jamaica or in Mali, right, you see in a way that you can't see elsewhere. No cloud, no fog, just really black cosmos as the backdrop to what? These stars. And then you're able to what? See the formation. And what happens is empirically, you develop what? Patterns, like the Dogon did. You see what star comes in formation, how often, and these observations are married to the agrarian cycle, right? When these grains and crops are available, and you ritualize them by having festivals, right? So these festivals essentially are celebratory markings of these observations that are cosmological but that are real, that then become essentially ritualized forms. And so in many ways, this is why African culture is not African culture, meaning it is a culture without a name. Because cosmology, ritual, agrarian life are just tightly bound together. They're tightly woven or braided together in a way that you can't name it one thing. And that's tough for people to conceptualize who are outside of the culture, outside of the language of those people that we call culture. So culture and spirituality are really just these poor substitutes or placeholders for something that can't be named and shouldn't be named, right? Should be lived. And so, Dogon spiritual culture as a temporary placeholder was such that you allow for these observations. So these observations, because they are uncomprehendable to a language and people outside of both, when we come to this debate that was sparked by Carl Sagan, who was an astronomer, well known. I think he taught at Cornell University, where I went to grad school. He argued that it's impossible for these Africans to have known about Sirius B or any other stars or constellation, because A, they don't have the brain power or the technology, B, and certainly if they did, they must have learned it from the Europeans who visited them, right? Classic Hamitic myth and hypothesis, right? These people are empty-headed, they have no way of knowing, which if you read Carl Sagan, what he's really saying is this, and I'm gonna translate him, for your audience, is that we couldn't have known what you've known without our gadgets much later than you did. That's what he's really saying, right? We don't know how you know what you know because we came to this observation in the 20th century, right? When you have known this centuries and millennia ago. And because you knew it before us, we can't give you any credit because we took so long to figure out with our gadgets and our technology and our know-how so late in the game, and we want to remain or maintain this hocus pocus that we're better than you, or superior to you, right? We have to get you out of your righteous mind by devaluing the meaning and even arguing to say that there's no way. But of course, the Dogon people on the cliffs, in their righteous mind, in their cultural base, on their spiritual culture and platform, to them it's not a debate. To them, it's not even worth debating or arguing about. It's lived. And so their ritual and festival continues. In fact, on YouTube, you can find some of these dances because they're masked at the occasion of these festivals and dances, but they only occur at certain times. And it's part of a much more larger cosmology, which may include, because it's part of the larger Mande people, right? May include the Akan people in that cosmology. Another conversation that we can have some other time. But it's a very wide and broad cosmology that stretches a quarter wider West Africa, right? It includes so many people that fall under the Mande or Mandekind umbrella.
Previously, I've heard you've been very critical of some of our leaders, right? So I wanted to ask your views on Marcus Garvey. Mm-hmm. Many people have a different view of him. Some see him as a hero, some see him as a villain. Mm-hmm. What is your view of Marcus Garvey?
Well, to me, Garvey's not a villain. Garvey deserved his flowers then and now. But as I've argued before in different forums, that all of the notables within the African world, they should be seen three-dimensionally. And even myself or any other person, three-dimensionally. And so by doing so, you allow to see them in full context, right? In all their full regalia and flaws. Because to me, what I find more fascinating is not the regalia, it's the flaws. And here's why, and this is what I mean. I can learn more from the flaws than I can from the regalia. In other words, the regalia is shiny and bright, and so building with others, the UNIA and African Communities League as a transnational and even a global organization was, tremendous. Yes, there were follies and mistakes. Yes, there were poor decision making around finances and who to trust. Yes, Garvey in some cases acted maniacal, and within reason, given who he had to trust. And what was at stake? The African world, in a time of heightened and intense European colonization of Africa, right? And so, seeing in his full three-dimensionality, to me, allows for more appreciation, not less. And we can remove villainy from the table, right? That's for the other people who again, want to demean and demolish, the work of Garvey, right? But his flaws are important. Just like Malcolm, getting 4 hours of sleep is and being unhealthy. You've seen pictures of Garvey, right? And so doing the work of one's people is not antithetical to doing the work of family and of self-care. And that's what I mean by I find the flaws more fascinating, because the flaws to me are windows or opportunities to say what we should be working on rather than what we should be glorifying. Because glorifying leads to stagnation and comfort. Those are, to borrow a line from Nas, the cousins of death. Right? When you're comfortable and stagnated, you're close to dying.
I want to say real quick, I learned a lot from Garvey. I see a connection between Garvey and Malcolm X Garvey and Thomas Sankara in regards to their shortcomings, right? Mm-hmm. That we can learn from. I think both were too committed to the cause more than their family. I think you got to find a balance. That's for Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X. But with Marcus Garvey and Thomas Sankara, I think they had the ambition. They overextended themselves. They didn't have the resources and the team to execute the ideas that they had.
So, I hear you. I'll push back only a bit on the resources, because I might have said this before, in our previous chats, that resources is really an excuse and sometimes a overblown necessity. Yes, resources are necessary, But the most important resources are the people and their commitment. And so if I have a group of committed people, the group can be 10 people, 100 people, 10,000 people, and they're committed, I don't worry about resource because there's that S word, sharing, right? 5 of us, 10 of us, can stack up in a minivan, right? We don't need, keyword need, a chartered bus, right? I remember when I was part of this African fraternity as an undergrad, our fraternity brothers come and visit. We were like 10 deep in my dorm room. You know as men do, head to feet. 3 of us on the bed, 3 of us on the floor. We had a rug. 2 of us on the couch. We make it work. And so that's about 2 things: people and commitment. We were people, brothers, and we were committed to the organization and each other, right?
But I should have, maybe the wrong word is not, I used the wrong word, not resources.
Mm-hmm.
I guess people skilled at what they're supposed to do. Because Thomas Sankara did utilize people, but they weren't skilled, or he didn't have enough time to train them to actually execute the mission.
And that's great. And by the way, this wasn't, necessarily personal to you. I'm saying for folks in general, they made the argument, I don't have the money. We don't have the resources, right? We don't have enough. We need funding, really. And so, look no further, your ancestors. What 401k they had? What, trust fund did they have? What foundation were giving them grants? You see what I'm saying? That to me is an excuse. So again, it wasn't necessarily personal, and I want to suggest that, right? But just for our viewers, that that's often a excuse, a blatant excuse for not doing, right? Let's look further in the ancestors. So people and their commitment, and the truth for Sankara. I'm not sure it was about time as it was about the timing, meaning same for Lumumba, the timing. So someone like Sankara, I don't think it's a matter of time, but timing, right? Much like Garvey, in terms of, when they come on the scene, what are the conditions that are there, right? Some people say that, Garvey was before his time, right? You hear that kind of saying, oh, Sankara was before their time, or Lumumba before their time. So I think timing does matter, right? In terms of when people come on the scene with their ideas or with their vision. Sometimes the timing is not there. The conditions, for example, may not be in line with the vision, right? So imagine Garvey in 2020 when Black Lives Matter jumped on the scene. And rather than Black Lives Matter, UNIA. You see what I'm saying? It's a wrap. So sometimes it's the timing of certain ideas and visions that come on the scene, because the conditions sometimes dictate what should be. So for me, and this is about strategy, right? I can't fault Sankara because there's a lot that that resonates with me in terms of Sankara's vision. But when you make something like that as a vision public, you bring certain attention. There's a way in which I think about the revolutions in Amilcar Cabral, who was a strategist, but he also was an agronomist. Know the land. He used the land with the people to fight against the Portuguese, right? And so to me, that marriage between knowing the land, agronomy and farming, and knowing the people and their culture, combined together, operated covertly, right? Having these camps, being mobile. So what I'm suggesting is that don't be movement-oriented and grandiose. Be maroon. Be guerrilla. Be strategic, right? Be hush harbor, like in the South, right? Yeah, be covert. Bringing attention to yourself will undo the very thing you're trying to accomplish, right? So I'm saying for Sankara and others, it is saying, we want to do this and making it public, right? We want to actualize this, right? Or Nkrumah telling, again, not picking on Nkrumah again, but he's there, he's on the ballot, on the slate. Telling the British, we want independence now. Independence was granted, which means it's not independence, right? That's a concession. So Cabral, he didn't ask the Portuguese for independence. You see? So I think you can learn more from Cabral than Sankara in the sense of strategy and bringing attention to yourself, given the conditions in which you find yourself. If you are anti-colonialist, if you are insurgent, if you are revolutionary against colonial forces, you can't speak about the very thing you want to them, especially in their idiom. In this, in Sankara's case, French, right? And so using the language, using the landscape, and using the culture, that's the winning formula. And being what? A combination of being maroon and being guerrilla and being covert, right? All these successful anti-colonial, struggles were guerrillas, were maroonage, were using the forest, using the landscape. So whether it's in Guinea-Bissau or Mozambique or in Angola, right, was using those strategies. Think about this. We aggrandize and praise African independence, but most of them were granted. What was that? The ones that weren't, they have a different sensibility about their independence than those that were granted. Think about the neo-colonial relationship, right? So I say that to say that one like Sankara, what I learned from him, all the flaws in terms of strategy, given the conditions and the timing which he came on the scene, but I rate his vision highly. There's lots to love about Sankara. But as I said before, I find more that's useful, as usable from the flaws than from the praise poetry.
Please share the story how you were born in Jamaica and ended up in the U.S. foster care system.
Great question. So obviously born in Jamaica and reared there by my grandfather until I was about 10 or 11. Came to New York, Brooklyn, New York, to be exact, around 86, 87. And within a year, a number of transitions happened. My grandfather passed away 2 months after I arrived in the States. And my grandfather and I were very close, still are. As you have heard from previous sessions, I talk highly a lot about him. And so that was tough. Not going to his funerary rites called Nine Night, which is a big ritual celebration in Jamaica and other parts of the pan-Caribbean world. That was really, really, really tough. And then 7 months later in July, my closest uncle, Uncle Bunny, and lots of Bunny in Jamaica, as we know, he passed away. He was found shot in his car, 2 a.m.
Hold on, before we go there, how did you end up with your grandfather in Jamaica? What happened to your mother and your father?
Well, my mom lived with us in a compound, as we call it in Jamaica, they call it the yard, right? And so the yard is a compound area where there may be 3 or 4 different rooms or like independent rooms, right? Like 1-bedroom houses, right? Basically. So my mother lived there, my grandfather and his wife lived there, my aunts lived there, which are my grandfather's children, with his wife. And my mom and I, and my brother lived there. And then my sister, she passed away 11 months old due to a fire in the house. So a number of things happened. She transitioned, my sister transitioned, Abina, AKA Tanya. She transitioned around 11 months old due to the fire. My mom was scarred by it, but she lived. Within maybe 2 years later, we were in the States. And then my grandfather transitioned, and then my uncle transitioned. And he and I were very close. And so when that happened, rather than family come together to, kind of sort of, hold the flood, right? It poured even more. My mom was sabotaged in 2 ways. My mom, who worked, as a home health aide, meaning she worked to take care of white people while my brother and I were home alone.
Foundation Jamaican job when you go.
There you go, right, indeed. And she went to school at LIU in Brooklyn for a nursing degree, right? So she was going to school and working full time, which means I, at 12 years old, 11, I took care of my brother and myself. And so on weekends, I didn't see my mom, right? And so in that moment, 2 things happened to my mom and us, but through my mom. One was that my mother, the woman that my father and mom never married. So he got another woman, he had children with her. And because this woman was jealous of my mom, because my father would talk about us, his sons, even though he didn't see us, he would talk about us. she became jealous and did spiritual work against my mom. Yeah. And so, and then my mother had sisters, different father, and these sisters, my aunts, went ahead and didn't do spiritual work, but they basically put my mother in Bellevue, literally, because they claimed that she was not right in the mind, and really she wasn't, because what happened in truth was that my mother was afraid for us, her young sons, her young children, and didn't send us to school for about a month or two. But that wasn't paranoia or a mental breakdown. That was because of the killer of my uncle, who was a friend of both my uncle and her from Jamaica, used to come to the window in the brownstone apartment where we stayed and knock on the window. So my mother had good reason to fear, right, for us. And so her sister, my aunt, interpreted that as a way to get back to her for what they felt my grandfather did wrong to their mother, right? So it was a bit of revenge and using that to bring my mother into Bellevue. And then of course, my mother, spiritual work was done against my mother, whereby she doesn't stay in the place for long. My mom, even, she becomes homeless. I'll get her an apartment, take care of her, food, clothing, whatever she needs. I'm there for her. Because my mother and I are close. But then she would never see settled. And that was a spiritual work. And then her sisters combined together, put her in that place. And so when my mother was removed to put her into Bellevue, we were put into foster care. I remember going to Children and Family Services office in Manhattan. We lived in the office for like 3 or 4 days. We were just staying in the office. And then we were brought to a home in Queens, and then we went to a place in East New York, I think around Myrtle and Broadway, for like a little while. It was nasty. And then we were brought to a place on Long Island called St. Mary's Children and Family Services. It was like a campus of sorts.
But how traumatic was that? How traumatic was that transition from being with your family to being around randoms with the state?
Well, I don't know how traumatic it really was, because I stayed focused on what was always important to me, was my family. And then my only family was my brother, younger brother. So I took care of him. Even though we're 2 years apart, we're actually much more years apart, because I was always like his father, which I'm sure, bothered him. But I had to be, because I was always older, than my chronological years, right? And so I didn't worry about trauma. I just worried about taking care of us. And I worried about getting back to my mother. And so I was there at the foster care home for about a year and change. And I went AWOL, because I knew the routines. And on a certain Sunday, I knew that they were lax. And so I just walked like I'm walking around, and I walked off the campus, and I walked down to the local LIRR train station in Syosset, Long Island, which is where the home was located. It's still there, by the way. And got on the train. Now I'm thinking in my New York City mind, I get on the train, right? I'm good. And so the conductor comes and asks for my ticket. Because the LIRR, for your viewers, on Long Island Railroad, you have to buy the ticket in advance or on the train. So I'm thinking in my New York City mind, once you hop the turnstile or you pass, you're good, right? So I didn't have money, looked at him, and then this white man, looked at me, and then he said, I'll pay for him. And he paid for me. And I said, thank you, right? And so got up at Nordstrom on the LIRR train. I knew my way by then. And so I walked, I knew once I could find Franklin Avenue, which we lived on Lincoln Place between Bedford and Franklin. And so I walked to Franklin. Once I got to Franklin, I knew, made that left on Lincoln Place, came to the apartment building. I think it's 576 Lincoln Place. Ring the doorbell. Guess who was there? My mother. She was shocked to see me. And the first question I had for her, I don't remember if I asked her, is that, why didn't you come first? But by then I saw her glazed look on her face. She was drugged out. They had pumped all the drugs in her. So my healthy, whole mother, who was going through a rough patch, was drugged up. My mom has never been the same. So I'm actually working on getting my mom back to Jamaica to heal her up. Yeah.
So she's up here?
She is. I'm trying to find her. She's on the streets. As I said, it's been a cycle. Putting her into a home, into an apartment, taking care of food, clothing, whatever she needs.
So how you deal with that? That seemed like a rough one, bro.
It is, but I guess I'm built for this. I don't get stressed about these things. I just focus on solution. You know, so I teach my daughters. I said there are no problems, just solutions. So if I focus on that, then I'll be stressed. So I just focus on, okay, I'm gonna find you, mom. I'm gonna find you. It's a big city, but I've seen her. She's come to me, and she doesn't want me to find her yet. But I know she's alive, but she's weak. So I see her in my dreams, for example, right? So I know she's there, but I'm working on it. Yeah.
And with the foster care system, right? You hear so many stories. You hear good stories. You hear bad stories. In your experience, what is the biggest misconception about the foster care system?
Whew, there's several. One of them is that it's a misnomer. The term in their phrase, foster care, there is no care. To me, it is the plantations. It's plantation slavery, because the same resources put into removing people from their homes and their families could be put into keeping them in their families. And I get the argument that sometimes children or child's life is in danger, and it is in those cases. But guess what? Those people have kinfolks, cousins, aunts, nephews, nieces, grandparents, right? Someone, even neighbors that know the children well. I'm saying those same dollars can go into repair and to say, hey, which, by the way, it happened, the same idea in terms of separating families from Mexico, right? Putting them with a kinfolks, right? Putting them with a relative. That should be the effort, not removing them into this violent, space. And I was with violent people. I mean, the people I was with, in Long Island, in the foster care home, in St. Mary's, these were young brothers, and other young men, a few white guys, and then there are a few Latino, guys and brothers there. A lot of them were from Spofford. Now shut down. Spofford was a juvenile prison, right? Notorious.
So they brought that same type of energy.
Man, listen. Now I can hold my own. In fact, they called me Little Rasta because I was from Jamaica, right? But they knew it, that they didn't mess with me, and therefore they didn't mess with my brother because I always had him. So I didn't get any trouble in that way, because I would fight anyone. I wouldn't look it, but you bring it to me, I'll bring it to you. So I didn't get messed with, but there were dudes there that, in fact, I witnessed a rape of a white woman who was a counselor there. In the foster care.
That's crazy.
Yeah, in the college where we were. And it's another story, and it's horrible because no one deserves that. No one deserves that. And I saw what they were doing, and they invited me in, and I said, I went downstairs. We used to have it on the second floor. By witness, I mean I knew what was going on inside, and they would look out, dudes at the door, and when they cracked the door, I just said, I want no part of this. I want no part of this. And I remember I felt for her, right? She's a human being, and so I felt for her. But I'm saying that's the kind of violence that I lived with. But it's not their fault. Because guess what? Criminals are made. So there are people that go to prison, but they're not criminals. They become criminals in prison. So these brothers became, that in the prison of the foster care. Without fathers, without love, without care. Keyword care, right? So that word is a deep misnomer. In fact, it's a violent cruelty, right? And the entire system is about fracturing and separating, which is what plantations did. Selling off, trading off, rupturing families. What's the difference?
But the question, I've never experienced firsthand. I've just seen from a distance. But I just think it's illegal to give so many kids to one person, to one family. Mm-hmm. I don't think they can provide the needs for that child. So it's just like, is it a situation where there are not enough families, or is it a hustle thing? Like, why does one family get 5, 6, 7 kids?
Because it's a hustle. It's a hustle. In fact, my aunt, who we stay with in Coney Island, hustled. You see, the city pays or the agencies involved, they pay the foster care parents a certain amount of money. So my aunt was getting paid money Even though she's our biological aunt, this was out of love. This was out of payment. And we didn't get any of it. Meaning my brother and I didn't get any of it. And so, and she was also getting money from St. Mary's, the foster care place. She was getting money from them. We got nothing. Only time we got something was in August when we went shopping for clothes. And she would cap it, and she would be there. We would pick out, or sometimes she would buy the clothes for us, right? So, and I know, folks who do this as a job. They have 5, 6 foster care children because of the money, not because the children all care for them. So it's a hustle, right? And it's a violent hustle because what's at stake are those lives that are ruined. Those destinies and potentials are ruined by the desire and the lust, for the money can be gotten, because there's no oversight. Yes, someone may come every month or 2 months or once in a while. There's no oversight for the daily violence that happens in these homes. And sometimes you can't even call them homes, right? A great example for your viewers, those who are not familiar with the system, would be Antoine Fisher, the movie. What happened in that? I know that as a fact. That's not hyperbole or fiction, but that's a great movie. Antoine Fisher, directed by Denzel Washington. Folks should check it out if they haven't already. That will give them a sense, and that's not make-believe. That's real.
And I know you said you focused on, you didn't say results. What you just say you focus on solutions, right? Where did the focus come to do something with yourself? Many people are broken. Many people are broken, period, right? But with those type of experience, many people get broken. Where did you get the strength, focus to do something with yourself and not let that consume you?
Ancestry. My close relationship with ancestry has always been there. They look out for me, and I know that because of the connection that I have with them, right? And that connection, which is, again, why I started the YouTube channel, Powered by Ancestry. That's why I named it so, because that is coming from lived experience. That is coming from decades of research, married to lived experience. That's coming from, healing and having clients who, last, 6 to 8 months. Almost all the clients, people that I work with, a lot of their spiritual and even mundane things, obviously, job, this, that, family, has ancestral roots, has ancestral symptoms, has ancestral, it's like a vector. That's the force field. And I'm like, this is the pattern over and over and over, right? So it is that relationship and that connection that essentially just sort of foments into being solution driven, being about, being growing, staying hungry, not being comfortable, right? So after 8 books and the press and this and children and whatever else and professorship and so on, I'm still hungry. My appetite has widened, not for food, right? To be clear, but just hungry for living out my purpose, right? And doing it in tandem. And then the more I do, the more they put on me, and the more I do, because they built me for this, and they give me the tools, they give me the resources, and I share that, give that, and if that empowers people, wonderful, because that in turn will allow them to be more whole and healthy. And again, once that moment clicks and people realize that, we aren't who they said we were or made us believe we were, and we sit on our nuclear weapon, our ancestry, our power base, it's a wrap. Then the world becomes right.